just as of last weekend, she was talking about turning Anchovy into a suckling pig restaurant because on Father's Day, T roasted off 3 suckling pigs over charcoal and wood, and so now she thinks she wants to run a suckling pig restaurant.
Today on Dirty Linen, we continue to chat about the future, but chatting about the future also means talking about the present and the past. I am really happy to be checking in with JY Lee from Anchovy in Richmond, inner city Melbourne. JY, how are you going?
Yeah, I'm very well, Dani. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I got up early this morning and made some pea and ham soup at Attica, giving it away to visa holders tomorrow. And yeah, it always feels good to start the day by making a delicious soup. It really sets you up for a good one. So I'd love you to clue people into Anchovy if they haven't heard of the restaurant, if they haven't had the pleasure of going there. Can you tell people what your restaurant is and does?
Yeah, so Anchovy is a pretty small restaurant. So in terms of footprint, we're like 35-seater restaurant and a small team. We are on Bridge Road in Richmond. So the restaurant itself focuses on sort of like mainland Southeast Asian flavors, so predominantly Vietnamese, just because that's T's heritage background. We're 5 years old now. We celebrated our 5th birthday in the middle of the first lockdown, which was fun. And yeah, here we are today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great restaurant, really creative, and you've certainly applied your creativity to the current situation, all the changes, the whirlwind that it is. And I caught up with you early on in the first lockdown, and you talked to me specifically about one of your visa holders and the process that you'd gone through supporting Georgina. Can you tell me about that story?
Yeah, so I suppose taking a step back from that, oh, actually, where should I start? So
Yeah, where do we start with these stories?
I don't know. So look, Anchovy, just going back to how small a restaurant we are, we've always had a small team. And with a small team, we find that one person does everything. So, you kind of need to be jack of all trades to some degree. So with that, people we sort of like have coming onto the team tend to be all rounders. And as a small venue, as a small business, I suppose when one person leaves, sometimes it's, half the team leaves because there are only 2 of us on the team, for example, in the dining room team in this instance. So T and I have always talked about this as a potentially a weakness of the business, where when someone comes and goes, like how do you continue building a team? How do you continue building a business? And so I think in maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we started looking into sponsoring someone, visa sponsorships, just because we, as a business, we struggled to find people to even apply for a job with us. And that was a bit of a struggle. So I remember there was one point we were just constantly putting up ads online, looking for chefs, looking for people for the dining room team, looking for anyone. So we kind of almost started the process 3 to 4 years ago, when we got ourselves into, I think, a business sponsorship role. So it started from there, and in that time, like, we've sort of considered sponsoring people that might not have gone through, and most of the times it's about sponsoring a chef, because oftentimes we find that there is a skill shortage, um, just a shortage in general. Like, you can't find anyone to apply for a job, and when they do apply for a job, sometimes their skills don't necessarily fit the mold. So at Anchovy, we do a lot of whole animal butchery, for example. So T learnt that skill herself just by, just I suppose by virtue of her being the owner of a restaurant and head chef, that she had the luxury, I suppose, to some degree of getting whole animal and then breaking it down and learning how to do it by herself. Um, and so, yeah, I think over time we realized as a small business there were certain skill gaps that we needed to fill. And I suppose fast forward to earlier this year, our team in the kitchen was changing slightly, and that someone had to go back home to one of our chefs had to go back home, and so we at the round about the same time we put out a job ad, and so Georgina was one of the applicants at the time, and the ad at the time was quite specific. So we needed we needed a chef who had experience in the industry at a specific level, who was familiar with whole animal butchery. And I suppose why whole animal butchery was so important to us as a small business is because as a small business, we can't necessarily always afford to get specific cuts in, and it's actually just cheaper to get a whole animal and break it down yourself. And it also gives us the flexibility to work with a lot of small farmers who generally send their animals in whole. So we put an ad up. There were many applicants. Not all of them qualified for the role. And Georgina was one of the ones who was actually the only one who qualified for that role. And so, yeah, we hired her, which was great. And we did not hire with the intention of ever sponsoring her necessarily, but it was part of the conversation because we knew she was coming to the end of her working holiday visa. So she's from the UK and she'd been in Australia for almost 2 years by then. And so I think part of it was that she was also looking for a workplace who could sponsor her. And so, yeah, we hired her, and about 9 days later, I think the lockdown was announced. And then,
Great
yeah,
timing.
yeah, we went into it. And I actually remember the conversation Tia and I were having with the team at the time. Like, our whole team at that very point in time was a team of what's the European Union, basically. So in the dining room with me was a lady from the UK, and then we had someone from Italy, someone from France, and a chef from the UK, Georgina. So yeah, we had the European Union sitting in front of us, T and I, and we were like, we know that. I suppose the conversation with the team we had was that things are quite uncertain, and this was just a bit before the lockdown was announced, and I think Georgina had just joined the team, so like 3 or 4 days in. And I remember we were sitting down for staff meal and we were actually discussing the whole shortage of pasta, sort of like panic buying thing and what we would do as a business. And the conversation then was that we would, as business owners, do whatever we could to keep the business going. And I remember looking around the table, and Georgina looked like she was about to be sick, because I think running through, I don't know what I thought might have been the situation was, I suppose she was maybe worried about her own future with the business. And I remember then I made the comments like, and I made the comment to everyone at the time, like, we want this to work so that everyone can keep their jobs. And for example, we can continue the sponsorship with Georgina. And so I felt like, well, okay, I've said that, so we kind of need to go ahead with it, and which we did. And grateful that we did, because yeah, it's turned out to be really good. So yeah, it was quite an interesting process, the going into lockdown.
Well, sponsoring someone is a big commitment for it's a big commitment for a restaurant, especially a small business like yourself. And I remember you saying to me that you got the $10,000 Victorian government grant was promised early on in lockdown, and you pretty much devoted that whole amount to the various fees and charges associated with putting through her sponsorship. So it was a pretty amazing commitment to show to a young chef who'd only been with you for a short time. It's interesting that you had all these people apply for the job and like they weren't qualified. And in terms of the butchery, like what kinds of things did people think that it meant when because obviously they would have read it and it says, oh, it says I have to be able to butcher whole animals, but then they're not qualified to do that. So what did they think butchery actually consisted of?
I mean, I don't interview the chefs, T interviews the chefs, but from some of the conversations I've heard, it's like being able to portion meat. So, you know, you can portion meat to 100-gram portions, for example. That's not really butchery in how Anchovy does it. You know, how we do it is we get, I mean, I'm not a chef, so I can't really go into big detail of it, but, you know, you actually get a whole pig in, or you get a whole lamb in, and you just break the whole animal down into different cuts so that someone like me, I can sell it on in the dining room to my guests. So, you know,
Yeah.
breaking down a whole lamb or whole pig is somewhat different to portioning Scotch fillet into 100-gram portions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well as being an economical way to deal with meat in a business, it's also so interesting. So I know that, I was there when T broke down a duck and then, the duck goes to this dish and that dish and then there's the sauce, it goes into the sausage as well. And, it's just it makes it, I mean, it's a big part of the food adventure at Anchovy as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I think that's one thing that T holds quite close to herself is, I suppose, coming in from with her family background. Her mom breaks down whole animals because I think, and this potentially goes back somewhat into Asian culture. You know, whole animals are fresh animal. You don't eat that animal unless you break it down, you kill it and break it down that day. Like I remember one of the first times I met T's mum, she broke down a whole chicken for dinner, like, you know, killed it, bled it, plucked it, cooked it for soup.
Great.
Great. So yeah, I think yeah, that definitely it's part of the skill. I think for T, it's a very big part of upskilling a chef, that one cut to the next cut. The anatomy of an animal. And as a business owner, I suppose that it really is, how can I maximize the coins I have? You know, how do I maximize what little profit margin I have from running a restaurant? And that's one of the ways to do it.
Well, let's talk about that because obviously your business has been really restricted, as everybody's has, and you decided very early on that you're going to keep it going and keep your staff employed. What kind of innovations did you make through, the early stages of the first lockdown and as things have gone on?
Yeah, look, we've Anchovies gone from being sort of a restaurant that focused a lot on Vietnamese flavors, which was what we were pre-COVID, to we went into being a Laotian takeaway joint. We started selling banh mi's through our shopfront window. What else have we done? We've done sort of like teas now going through a premium seafood bend, where she's just finding whatever premium seafood she can and just cooking it. And yes, as of last weekend, she was talking about turning Anchovy into a suckling pig restaurant, because on Father's Day, on Father's Day, T roasted off 3 suckling pigs over charcoal and wood, and so now she thinks she wants to run a suckling pig restaurant. So
Wow.
Anchovy's been through Anchovy's been through a few different iterations, and I think we were talking about that the other day, and I don't think any of this has been planned. We didn't necessarily plan to do this or do that. Everything, I think some of the opportunities just happen to present themselves. And other things like T's always talked about wanting to cook Laotian food, and I used to tease her a lot, pre-COVID, that if she looked at her food, she wasn't cooking Vietnamese food, she was cooking Laotian food masquerading as Vietnamese food, because all the dishes were Laotian, Laotian flavors. And so we did that, and in the last T's a serial. She loves looking through real estate, commercial real estate. And every time she looks through, she's like, oh, what do you think we can do with this space? Or what do you think we can do with that space? So one of her dreams has also always to run, like, she's always wanted to run a sandwich shop, a banh mi shop. We've looked up pieces of real estate, and she's like, I remember we've gone as far as almost writing up a business plan to sell sandwiches. And when coronavirus hit, that was one of the things T pounced on, because Bridge Road became really, really quiet. So Bridge Road is the main thoroughfare. So you get so many cars coming through, you get trams coming through, you get people from all walks coming through. And yeah, in the first lockdown, it became really, really quiet, to the point T said, if we don't do something fun and exciting, it's like as if Anchovy might just fade into oblivion, because the whole street was so quiet. There was no one around. So in T's head, she wanted a loud, fun sort of. She pitched the idea to me. She was like, imagine if you're walking past the street, and if you're walking past, and suddenly you get like crazy Vietnamese music playing, and you smell smoke, and you hear all these sounds, like you just imagine you're in Asia but on Bridge Road. So that was how she sold the whole sandwich shop idea to me. And so yeah, um it's part of it was innovation, and part of it, I think, it's really T finding the opportunity to do things like this. And just like, the whole premium seafood thing, T's always, and I've kind of always wanted to talk her out of it, but she's always wanted to install fish tanks like on site at Anchovy, just so people can pick their own premium lobsters or crabs or fish for her to kill and cook on site. And I think this has just given her the opportunity to do that. So one of the things T said to Gina last week, and it really got me thinking, was that she said, we are really, as a business, as Anchovy, as a restaurant, we are extremely lucky at the moment, because our customers are paying us to experiment, to learn. Last week alone at Anchovy, we sold 13 lobsters, 2 snow crabs, and 3 suckling pigs.
Wow.
And she said to the team, we like no at no point ever will we ever get this opportunity again. And so I think for us, it's about learning, and it's about doing what we can with whatever opportunity you're presented with. So, let's not be sad about it, but let's see what we can do with what's in front of us.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Let's just track back a little bit for people who aren't familiar with Laotian food. Can you just give us a little primer?
Yeah, so Laotian food for me, it's sort of like the funkier, spicier, fresher version of Vietnamese food. So Lao is quite a landlocked country. Well, not quite, it is a landlocked country. So you get lots of river fish, river prawns, river crabs, all of which is fermented and used in the cooking. So the food's quite pungent. They love their chili, so it's extremely spicy, and they use lots and lots of herbs. So that's where the freshness comes in. And so, yeah, I think T's palate lends itself to that. She grew up eating a lot of Laotian food. So T grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and always ate Laotian food as when mum didn't feel like cooking, ate Laotian food. So she grew up with Laotian food and Laotian flavors. And there's quite a large Laotian community out in Fairfield in Sydney. So I think that's where sort of like that comes from. Some of the key dishes that T's more familiar with, includes like papaya salad, which you find, for example, in Thai cuisine. But Laotian papaya salad is infinitely more spicy and infinitely more pungent because of um, the fermented river crabs used. You get things like raw beef salad. You get duck labs or fish labs, for example. So it's quite, I think the dishes itself you would find in any mainland Southeast Asian restaurant. It's just the intensity of flavor and palate that varies. Yeah.
Mm, yum. You're making me so hungry. JY, what's your food background?
Mine. So I'm Chinese heritage. I'm from Brunei, so a bit of a mishmash. So, and I suppose that's where I draw the distinction in Southeast Asian flavor. So for me, tea is mainland Southeast Asia, whereas my food background or my palate is probably more of the islands of Southeast Asia. So Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia.
Okay.
That sort of like, yeah.
So how did you meet T?
Um, we met. Like we met outside of the hospitality industry. We met through a mutual friend. Um, so I wasn't in hospitality back then. I was actually working in research. So and yeah, no, a lot. And I enjoyed hanging out with her because I liked eating, and I still do. And I actually just wanted someone who could go to restaurants with me to eat. That's how we met.
Yeah, great. I love hearing the way. Yeah. I love hearing the way that you guys like plan things and bounce ideas off each other. It sounds like you're the one that you're a bit of a gatekeeper, like trying to rein in some of T's like amazing and crazy ideas. But I wonder if there's going to be a fish tank in Anchovy at the end of all this, or perhaps it's, I don't know, or is it all going to be suckling pigs? Is it going to be pigs on one side and tanks on the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that makes us work well together is that T has so much energy, and just she wakes up thinking about things, and I can't keep up. She has so much energy in her, and I am incredibly risk averse. I'm incredibly risk averse, so I will always think of the downsides of something. Some would say I'm almost too pessimistic for this. So T's the optimist in the relationship. I'm the pessimist in the relationship, and I think yeah, look, I think that's worked quite well. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, to get to 5 years in a small restaurant and to still be feeling very positive about the future during a pandemic, I think it definitely says that you've got the balance right in terms of those different energies flowing through your business. And I remember when I spoke to Georgina for an article that I did about visa holders back in April, and she talked about, she seems like such an incredible young chef, like so desperate to learn and just really excited about soaking up everything that she could at Anchovy. She didn't have any familiarity with Asian flavors, but she was just really just so thrilled to have that opportunity. And she definitely sees herself as a future restaurateur. I think what an amazing experience for her as a young chef to be with you guys during this dreadful year and watch you being so innovative and nimble and to see it as an opportunity. I mean, I feel like we need to get her on the show as well just to see how she's going with all this.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. One of the things that I absolutely love about Georgina is that she kind of just goes along with the flow. I think that's one of the hardest things about working in a small business, especially in a small business where, you know, both your bosses might come from very different perspectives, is that she just says yes and goes along with anything and everything we throw at her. She's incredibly open to everything, and she kind of just like questions everything and does her own research on everything and forms an opinion on everything, forms an informed opinion on everything. And I think as a small business, that's what is important to us. I mean, you don't necessarily want someone who just says yes and rules over, but you don't want someone who, what's the word, sort of like who argues with you or talks back to you every step of the way, but you want someone who can offer an alternative perspective, an alternative opinion, a constructive opinion to a conversation. So I think that's what's made her such a valuable addition to the team.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked on this podcast to people who have businesses of all different sizes, people with multiple venues, across multiple states, for example, and people with much smaller businesses. I mean, what do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages of running a small restaurant as you do?
I think the most glaring advantage that we've had as Anchovy is that while our whole team doesn't qualify for JobKeeper, for example, so only T and I qualify for JobKeeper, but that I mean, our team's small enough that we are able to control it and just give them the opportunities or whatever it is that we can to help them out through whatever this thing is, as opposed to, say, a larger business with 20, 30, 40, 50 staff members. Like, we're lucky that we've got a team of 4, of which T and I make up 2. I think as a small business, we are in a position to be a lot more flexible, and just, like you see, at least we've seen it through the lockdown. In the first lockdown, we could switch overnight and become a Laotian restaurant, and then we became a sandwich shop, and the lockdown got lifted and the second lockdown came along, and T and I decided it would be too much of a cop out to go back to Laotian, so did something different instead. So that gives us a lot of flexibility to do that. I think one of the other things I've discussed a lot with T is that as a small business, we probably benefit a lot more from, say, the Victorian government like business grant, a $10,000 grant. Like, $10,000 to us as a small business is a lot more than what $10,000 means to a business that hires 40 other people. So we've been in a position to manage our costs a lot more.
Yeah. So, what do you think is going to be ahead for Melbourne restaurants, Melbourne restaurateurs, and Melbourne diners? I mean, obviously, we've got a longer lockdown than anybody else. It's going to be a slow path out, and it's fantastic to hear you guys. So yeah, still innovating and still optimistic and still using this unfortunate series of events as an opportunity to try new things out on your loyal customers. But do you think things are going to be really different on the other side of this?
Look, I think yes and no. I couldn't tell you, to be honest. I think things will definitely have changed. It will never go back to what it was before. I think T and I have come to terms with it and we've accepted it and we've moved on. So it's about looking at what's there in the future. Like, I mean, if you were to put it really crudely, what do you do when life hands you a shit sandwich? You just find a way to move on. And I think that's what we have to do. I think, like, to continue to think back to it could have been this, it could have been that, I think is a mentality that will drag us down. So, and I suppose where we come from, especially where I come from, Tia and I went through a stage in the life of the business and our personal lives where it was quite hard, and we went through that stage of it's like, and this was going back 2 or 3 years ago, and we thought, well, if this has happened, we wouldn't be in this position, or if that had happened, we wouldn't be in this position. We came to terms at that point in time that was the position we were in, and we can't go back in the past. So how can we essentially dig ourselves out of this hole? And I feel that's the mentality we've taken with us heading into coronavirus, which is it is what it is. You can't stop a virus. You can't stop something you can't see. So how do you get on and move on with it? And look, without getting too political, regardless of how this all pans out in the next 2 or 3 months, and in the short term, the next 2 or 3 months, in the next 6 to 12 to 48 months, you kind of need to roll with the punches, and just not think about, well, this was what happened last Christmas, so I wish this could happen this Christmas, because it's just not going to be the case, unfortunately. Does that kind of answer the question?
Definitely. I mean, I guess you're just looking forward. So you're building on, you're doing what's possible, and you're looking forward, and you're creating the future.
Kind of. And I think about this a lot, and I don't know whether it's directly comparable, but I feel like, so like I feel like, you're I'm Asian in sort of like quite an Anglo society. When I came to Australia back in 2004, the assimilation component was, I thought about it quite a lot. You're female in quite a patriarchal society. I mean, my relationship with T was 2 years ago to be determined by a postal vote. I feel like you go through stages in your life where you're like, well, okay, all these things are sort of like, out of your control, but you've dealt with it. So this is the same thing. It's out of your control. How are you going to deal with it? The virus is out of your control. How are you going to deal with it? The state government has made certain decisions, which, I mean, personally, I know they're a bit harsh, but I don't completely disagree with all of them. So how do you deal with it? It's this, it's just looking at how you deal with things, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's also, as you say, it's looking at it's controlling the things you can control, and just accepting the things that you can't. And getting on with barbecuing some pigs in the meantime. JY, it's been such a pleasure to hear what you're up to and how you're thinking about things. And I, for one, cannot wait to see what Anchovy becomes, and as it continues to innovate, continues to deal with the circumstances, and I'm sure continues to thrive. But thank you so much for coming to have a chat today to Dirty Linen. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's all right. Thanks for having me.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about. We spend a week thrashing around each issue, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This is a Deep in the Weeds production.